Okay, well, one of the things that I think, and this is both to Ismahan and to Dino, because when I was in Taiwan and we saw protected agriculture in these very marginal environments where people could still be productive using some sort of protected agriculture, and we know that it's really, increasingly more is so in the Middle East and the GCC. Is protected agriculture the way of the future in terms of being able to, get a really good crop off marginal lands? Do you think it's, both of you, I mean, you both come from that sort of background, so you can talk to that.
Well, I'm convinced that in the next 10 to 20 years, virtually all vegetables will be grown under protection. And that's not because that you get benefit from growing tomatoes in a greenhouse because of the tomato environment. It's because you can prevent insects from getting at the tomatoes or whatever it happens to be. Because vegetables are so prone now to a whole range of viruses and pathogens and other things that it almost ceases to be productive if you expose them under field conditions. And we talk about climate change. One of the things that we are very concerned about in AVRDC is that we predict about a 1 degree centigrade increase in average temperature in the next 25 years. And it's not the increase in temperature per se that's a problem with vegetables, is that you get an additional 3 generations of whitefly, I don't know how many additional generations of thrips, several generations more of helicoverpa and other pod borers, and these things essentially make vegetable production uneconomic. So therefore I expect in 20 years virtually all of the vegetables will be grown under cover. And if you don't have that opportunity, then you need to be able to adopt other policies like having a much greater diversity of vegetables in, let's say, your home garden, because then you can fool the insects to say that you've got a range of different things. Or you can try to grow vegetables in the off-season, which goes against the normal cycles of the insect damage. So there are things you can do, but actually we have such good plastic and such good netting these days that it makes a lot of economic sense to grow your vegetables under nets. You should be able to pay off the cost of those things within a season or two, and after that, you should be able to laugh your way all the way back to the bank.
Ismahan, what about from the sort of the MENA region?
So I agree with Dino. I think for vegetables particularly, maybe the protected agriculture would be the way to go. And the reason behind it, it's mostly economic from our experience. When you talk about marginal environments, and especially the one where we have experience within IFPRI, it's the major limitation, it's water scarcity and it's heat and drought. And in these conditions, it's very difficult to have really open agriculture. So most probably in many of these countries, we will be looking at protected agriculture to multiply mostly vegetables.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you very much, because you talked about water.
Yes.
So, Tim, with fresh water often scarce in marginal environments, what's the role of non-conventional water resources for agriculture? And maybe you explain a little bit about what you mean by non-conventional water as well.
In many marginalized or marginal environments, freshwater resource is very scarce. And because of low rainfall in these areas also, the amount of water stored in aquifers underground is also very limited. And if agriculture is also going on in these areas, there is going to be over time depletion of the water table, and that necessitates looking at non-conventional sources of water to supplement and to reduce pressure on freshwater sources. There are two main non-conventional sources of water. One is desalination of seawater and brackish water, which essentially is trying to make those water resources useful both for domestic, industrial, and irrigation purposes. In Gulf states, such as United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, they have over the years invested a lot in desalination of seawater and brackish water, but it's a very expensive business. And it's not the kind of investments that most developing countries in Africa can go into. And that leads to the other second non-conventional source of water, which is treated wastewater. In Africa, the rate of urbanization is growing at a very phenomenal rate. When I first came to Ethiopia in the late 80s, and compared to what it is now, there are landmarks in Addis I couldn't even recognize when I came back. But in these mega cities that are springing up all across developing countries, they use enormous quantity of water that can actually be treated to recover and reuse water, energy, and nutrients. And my institute, the International Water Management Institute, is actually doing some novel work in this area, looking at how wastewater can be treated safely, both for certain domestic uses, but also for irrigation, and in the process also recover and reuse the nutrients and the energy involved in them. But what is also important is not to do this purely on a public investment basis. What is needed is to actually insert these treatment plants within a business model that will bring in the private sector as well. So it becomes a public-private and producer partnership so that the sustainability of the system becomes assured, because then if people are making money out of the recycling, then they will see that as a profitable business, and that will provide the necessary capital to replow into the treatment plants and make it much more sustainable over time.
Okay.
Can I
Yep.
add just a
Just-
little bit to
absolutely.
that? Just from some reading I've come across recently, a dimension of this is, especially in the area of industrialization, where you have a lot of pollution from industrial plants going into the water system, and those same waters being used for irrigation, and that ending up in the food supply. So the quality of food can be significantly harmed by that. Actually, the one of the articles I was reading is about how big this issue is becoming in China, for example, in areas where you have mining and the introduction of minerals like cadmium, like arsenic and the like, into the water supply, and that ending up in food supply. And I think recently, I'm not sure if it's the Ministry of or the Environmental Protection Authority of China has actually published a book. It's in Chinese, so but I saw the reference to it. So it's soil health and soil pollution. So another area of marginalization of land is from industrialization and pollution, and the impact that it has on water. So I think dimension two.
Ismail, I'm going to come to you and ask a little bit about, we've talked, in some of these marginal environments that you have to have the right crop for these things. And one of the things that I know IFPRI is working on is this idea of the underutilized and neglected plant species. What is the role of these particular species in marginal environments, and is there some benefit to them?
So I think to start with, marginal environments are not made up for normal commodities or like major commodities which we are working with. And the reason behind it is that their genetic makeup, it's not for marginal environment. They have been bred now for decades and decades for high inputs. So we have changed the genetic makeup of most of those major commodities to make them not survivable in those marginal environments, unless maybe we go to wild relatives in the Yemen for the wheat, or land races in the origin of the wheat or maize or rice. And for that reason, for marginal environment, I think the only crop that we have to go with and the only ones that we could survive and make a difference in marginal environments would be the neglected and underutilized species. And the reason behind it are three. The first one is that they are highly adapted to marginal environments. And that's, again, because of the natural selection. There was a natural selection, they were able to survive. Like, for example, if I give you an example in the desert, I always thought desert has no crops whatsoever. And then when I start living in the UAE and driving through the desert, as soon as you have a little bit of rain, it's a blooming desert. You wouldn't understand it, you wouldn't believe it. As soon as you have a little bit of humidity, you got some crops coming up. So that's one. The nooses are naturally has been surviving in marginal environments and have been very much adapted to that. The second one, they are in general low nutritional requirement. So several of them, they don't require much. So if I give the example of quinoa, for example, and Dino was talking about the highlands in the Andes, the soil, it's amazing. It has almost nothing. And still that crop will grow with a little bit of water mainly. So in general, those nooses, they don't require much input. And on the contrary, they have very high nutritive values. So you could talk about the teff, we could talk about quinoa. They have a lot of the composition of the protein and of the amino acid. It's very, very interesting. And it could be because the productivity is not that high. Maybe once we get to them to be very productive, we might lose on the nutritional side. The third is that in general, they are very good buffer against environmental changes. So most of those nooses, they survive because they are produced regardless if you got enough rain, not enough rain, too much heat, and so on and so forth. So they secure like a minimal production. And the example of Yemen, it's very interesting, is that those communities that have lived for many, many years on those native species, most probably they are native, they are very adapted to that, and it's because they give the communities a minimum productivity regardless of the environment. So in a maybe a favorable year, they're gonna produce very well, and in less favorable year, they could still have something. It's not zero, like we're gonna have with the genetically bred commodities that in arable land we are using. So that gives you a little bit of sustainable livelihood in those areas. So unfortunately, we haven't done enough research on the nooses. So the nooses has been marginalized also throughout the years because there was too much focus on investment in arable land and investment in only few crops. So we got about 60% of our protein that comes from maize, rice, and wheat. We got 7,000 species that have been used by humankind, but very, very few of them we know about their potential. We haven't done much research to understand their value on the nutrition side, and we haven't done much research on breeding them and maybe make them more productive under certain conditions. So, but I think in one of days, especially when we talk about resilience of commodities and resilience to shocks, I think it's very important that we revert back to those 7,000 species, choose the ones that have the most promising to a certain area and look at them. Because A, we're gonna be 9 billion by 2050, so we won't have enough. B, arable land productivity, it's almost maximized, except maybe in Africa where we know we could have much more productivity. And the most important one is because of climate change, we're gonna get more marginalized environments. So all this combination makes it that it's very difficult for us to produce enough for the people by 2050 unless we invest in marginal environments, and those marginal environments, as you said, Fiona, need the right crop. So if I wanna a little bit expand on the economic side and to just add of what Sam said, we had model farms in the Emirates. And what we were really surprised, it's true, it's very expensive, as Tim said at the beginning, to bring land, to just rehabilitate land. It's very expensive. At the beginning, it's very high investment. So in Abu Dhabi, there was a lot of salinization because of mismanagement and because of taking water from groundwater and using it. So what we did is that we went to one of the farms, actually 3 farms, but I'll talk about one specifically. And what we did, we brought the right crop. So instead of alfalfa and Rhodes grass, which is very, very thirsty crops, we brought species like proboscis, like disticulus that are native species to the region. And within 2 years and a half, the farmers, he used to have about 80 sheep and goat. He had about 400 that are completely grazing on the material in the model farm. On the top of that, he was using only 25% of the water. So I think economically at the beginning it's very, very expensive, but at the longer term it pays back, definitely. Yeah. So if maybe just to end up, a few examples of the species that we are very interested in because of their adaptability to marginal environments is quinoa, definitely. There are a lot of species, there are a lot of countries in the Middle East that are interested in quinoa. And luckily enough, quinoa is very elastic. It goes from the lowland to 3,800 meters. It produces very, very well under very harsh and saline environment. Other species are like, for example, amaranthus. You got the forages, that's really the core of it. Most of the marginal lands are very, very good to have forages and to have an integrated system between livestock and forages. Millets is another one, sorghum is another one, and many others.